Hi guys, welcome to my channel and another painting in my watercolour sketchbook. Now, as you may know if you've watched any of my previous videos, I love drawing animals and wildlife, but today I want to incorporate this with a bit of practice on something I'm not so good at, and that's florals. So with the weather in the UK having taken a bit of a nosedive, I thought I'd paint something bright to hopefully help bring the sun back, and I came up with this reference photo of a sunflower with a brightly coloured butterfly on it. I printed the main part of the photo reference off on my computer to help me plan the sketch, and started out by drawing this out with an HB pencil. I haven't gone into too much detail on this process today, as my main focus is going to be on the painting techniques I use, and for this one I'm mainly going to be using the wet on dry technique. So without any further delay, let's get on with the video. As always, all the materials I'm using will be listed in the description box below, along with the reference photo from Pixabay. I'm using my Winsor and Newton professional watercolours today, which I bought in tubes and squeezed out and allowed to dry in this palette. After activating them with a few drops of water, I used my reference photo again to swatch out some colours on the corner of my sketchbook. I picked Winsor Yellow and Yellow Ochre Light for the sunflower's petals, along with some burnt umber for the darker shadow areas. I chose Sepia for the darkest part of the sunflower and Winsor Red with a bit of neutral tint for the base colour of the butterfly's wings. For the leaves, I've gone with Hooker's Green and thought I'd mix this with neutral tint again to give me a nice dark green for the darkest shadow areas. With that done, I begin by painting a base layer of that Winsor Yellow to one of the petals using the wet on dry technique. So my brush is wet, but I'm applying watercolour to dry paper. I drop in a bit of Yellow Ochre Light here too, just on top of the Winsor Yellow. I skip painting the next petal as I don't want either the paint from the first one to bleed into the second, or for any more watery paint to seep into the first petal and create blooms. Again, I add in some Yellow Ochre Light and let it mix with the Winsor Yellow. And I carry on like this, painting alternate petals around the rest of the flower, and use my reference photo to put in more or less Yellow Ochre Light for each petal as needed, so they don't look too uniform. Another thing I tried to do was to look at the direction of any visible veins in each petal and use my brush strokes to match, even leaving some of the white of the paper in parts to help convey shape and form and develop a bit more of an interesting look to my petals. Now by this time all of my first petals had completely dried, so I could go round and fill in the other petals using the same techniques before starting work on some of those leaves. Here I've mixed up some watery Hooker's Green and again begin by applying it to dry paper on the left hand side. I'm really just getting some paint on the paper at this stage, and will add more detail once it's dry. Like I did with the petals though, I do drop in some darker colour onto the wet paper to the areas of each leaf that appeared darker on my reference photo. For the larger leaf at the bottom here, I was a bit more intentional with my brush strokes and painted in the direction of the veins on the leaf, rather like I tried to do with the flower petals. The veins on this leaf are more defined, so I painted more in sections so I didn't lose sight of the details. It might still look pretty loose and sketchy at this point, but this is just a first layer which I can build on later on. I did also try to vary the intensity of my watercolour here to help map out the overall structure of the leaf. So I added more water to my paint for the lighter areas and more pigment to the darker areas under the petal and on the curled underside of the leaf. I left the stem and the area under the sunflower quite loose, just by painting some watery green here and dropping in sepia onto the wet paper. Right, so now it's time to paint the dark centre part of the flower, and for this I'm using a size 1 Derwent water brush and some concentrated sepia. I like to use this brush for fine details, and as I did with the petals and leaves, I'm applying paint onto dry paper. This sunflower here has quite a textured surface, and I try and replicate this by using a dabbing motion with the tip of my brush. So the wet on dry technique is not only good for painting in fine details and precise lines, it's also good for adding in texture, and with less water your colours will stay nice and strong without being diluted by any water on your paper. And with the first layers of my sunflower all dry, I can now go in and start painting the butterfly. I'm still using the water brush here, but mainly just for the fine point. This is quite a small area, so I want the control of painting on dry paper again. I've mixed a very small amount of neutral tint to Winsor Red and add in a tiny amount of cadmium orange too. I can increase the colour intensity a bit here just by adding in more pigment onto the damp paper. Then I repeat the same on the other side before painting in the lower wings. Here I've used the same method as before, but I've just softened the edges out a bit using a clean damp brush. Next, I work on defining the outside edge of the butterfly wings and the body using watery sepia. I drop in a more concentrated sepia onto the damp paper to get a bleeding out effect to the edges. For the body and head, I initially apply more watery sepia, but then drop in more concentrated sepia to the centre and let it spread out across the damp paper. I use the concentrated sepia and the dabbing motion again with my brush to add markings to the lower parts of the body and fill in the part of the sunflower that I'd missed before. With that dry, I could then start to fill in the rest of the markings on the wings. I used a dilute mix of Winsor Red with Winsor Blue to create the mauve markings. And added in some yellow ochre light for the more yellow ones. I needed to allow these colours to dry so that when I added in the darker markings they wouldn't all bleed together. In the meantime, I started adding burnt umber to the area of wing nearest the body and used a dotting motion with my brush to add in neutral tint on top. This helped to add both detail and texture. I carried this dotting texture over the red parts of the wings as well nearest the butterfly's body, and started to mark in just a few lines to hint at details here as well. By now, the colourful mauve and yellow markings I'd painted in earlier had dried, so I can go in and add the darker markings around them. For this, I'm using concentrated neutral tint, as I prefer it to black. I apply this paint here using dots rather than solid blocks of colour, as I think it looks more natural. I continue to use this method to carefully paint in the rest of the darker markings on the wings, as well as around the outside edges of them. So the first layer is done and dry, and I think it looks okay. It's a bit pale and wishy-washy right now, but that first layer enabled me to map out the different shapes, structures and colours and so on, which makes painting the next layer a lot easier. I started with the leaves this time and have switched up to my larger size 8 brush again. I'm using more pigment now to build up those values, but I'm still painting wet on dry, as I want to concentrate on working in more details around the veins in the leaves. For me, the leaves were probably the most challenging part of this painting, as like I said at the start of this video, it's an area where I need to practice and want to improve. My general aim was not to fill in each and every fine hair or vein in the leaves, but more just to create something believable. So something that looks semi-realistic and natural without needing hours and hours of work and lots of layers. And sketchbooks are a great place to practice. With this sketchbook, despite being a watercolour sketchbook, I am limited to 1 or 2 layers, as it's not cotton paper and much like some plants, doesn't do well with being overwatered. So I've done my best to get the balance right, and what I lack in detail, I've tried to make up for in value. But let me know in the comments what you think. I might even try another botanical painting on cotton paper to compare it with, so let me know as well if that's something you'd like to see here on my channel. For the area under the sunflower, I decided to keep it quite loose, just adding in some sepia and softening any edges with clean water. I also darkened up the leaf on the left hand side again. Now I turn my attentions back to the sunflower, and for the second layer on the petals I went back to using my water brush so I could add in more detail and shading, and rather than add in the darker shadows with just burnt umber as I'd originally planned, I decided to add in quinacridone gold, which it turned out was the perfect colour for this. It almost brought in another element of luminosity and vibrancy to the picture, which I really liked. Sometimes adding in different colours and certainly complementary colours to shadow areas can really help to lift a piece, and it's worth experimenting with instead of just reaching for dull greys or browns. For the centre of my sunflower, where I thought it needed to be darker, instead of just adding black for example, I went over with a layer of neutral tint, and this has some violet pigment in it. This helped to add value whilst complementing well with the yellow petals. I used the same neutral tint to darken up the butterfly's body and the darkest markings on its wings too. I'm still working on dry paper, and I'm laying over the paint using the same dotting technique as I did before. This time though, I'm adding in a few more details using the reference photo to help make sure it's accurate. Once that's all completely dry, I can go in and add a second layer to those red markings, just to brighten them up in line with the rest of the painting. For this, I mix up a more concentrated Winsor red and mix in a bit of Winsor blue this time, and I concentrate more pigment where the wings meet the body. Next, I work on darkening up the brown markings on the bottom wings, as this area has dried a lot lighter than it needs to be. I also correct the shape of the wing here. I then continue to darken up the brown areas on the outside of the top wings too. And go in and add a more blue-violet mix to the mauve areas I painted in earlier. And as is often the case, having added more value to the rest of the painting, it highlighted the need to add more colour to another area of the painting. So I built up the colour to this bottom leaf again. For this I'm using Hooker's green. It's not as dark as the green I mixed for the shadow areas, but matches in better now with the colour of the leaf on the other side. Now with the painting done, it's time to add in a few last details with my black fine liner. I started out using this 0.3mm black unipin liner for the butterfly's antennae. This isn't the fine liner I usually use, but it's the one I grabbed first and was actually a bit thick. So for the rest of the finishing touches to the wings, I switched back to my black Copic multi-liner. This is also a 0.3mm, but it's the one I prefer. I also used it to pull out a few details to the centre of the sunflower, and with that, this painting was complete. I had a lot of fun with this one, and I'm quite pleased with how it turned out. And as much as there's always room for improvement, I love the bright colours and was glad I went out of my comfort zone a bit today. I think that using the wet on dry technique definitely helps if you want a bit more control over your paint, as working wet in wet can be a bit more unpredictable. But I'd love to know what you think of the painting and what methods you like to use in your own artwork, especially for painting botanicals. If you did like this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my channel if you'd like to see more paintings like this one. Hit the bell icon too to be notified as soon as I upload a new video. Thank you all so much for watching, have a great weekend, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!